Shalom, everybody. Oh, yeah. Shalom.
Shalom.
Yeah. How many of you have been enjoying the conference so far? How many of you have learned new stuff about Torah? You know, one of the things we learned about was hear and do. How many of you are ready to hear and do?
Amen. Amen.
Don't speak so fast. But I'll explain what I mean about that in a minute. You know, the rabbis, you know, they don't proselytize. And then if somebody does want to become a proselyte Jew in Rabbinic Judaism, they turn them away 3 times. Yes. And then if they still come to them after 3 times, then there's something else they're required to do. They're required to discourage them by telling them what? Anybody know? The financial obligations of the covenant. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And once they know the financial obligations of the covenant, they probably don't want to do it. So that's one of the things I want to discuss today. And you know, there's a little story that the scientists of the world, they finally developed the ability to create life. They finally found just the right mixture of materials to put in a little chamber and zap it with a little electricity in just the right way and have something crawl out of it, you know. And so they challenge, one of them gets kind of haughty and he challenges Elohim to a duel, if you will, to a contest. So they both show up. The scientist says, okay, you go first. So Elohim reaches down and he takes some clay from the earth and he forms a man out of it and he breathes life into it. And he says, there you have it. There you go. Life. And the scientist says, that's nothing. Now it's my turn. He reaches down to scoop up some clay. Elohim looks in and says, no. You make your own dirt.
I like that.
The moral to the story is that everything, all the raw materials of this earth, everything that you see around you belongs to Elohim.
Yes.
It was here when we were born. It will be here when we die. Okay? You can't take it with you wherever you're going. Okay? The rabbis say that when we come into this world as babies grabbing for everything. And when we finally die, our hand falls loose and we leave it all behind. Okay? Land ownership. Where did land ownership ever come from? I mean, my friend Steve from Truth Talk, I don't know if any of y'all listen to Truth Talk, Steve used to say that the concept of land ownership came the day that one man became arrogant enough to tell another man to stand on a piece of land that was there when they were both born and would be there when they were both dead and point at it and say, mine. And war got started when the other man got arrogant enough to look back at him and say, no, mine. Okay? It's like 2 fleas arguing over who owns the dog that they live on. Okay? By the way, that war is recorded, that exchange is basically recorded in the book of Genesis. It was Cain and Abel. That's what it's about. This is my land. No, it's mine. It's neither of yours. Okay? But somehow we got into this rat race of thinking that we could actually own little pieces of this planet. And so that's the world we live in, and that's the way it is. Okay. But who does everything belong to?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Everything that we create, who does it belong to?
Yahweh.
Who do you belong to? Okay. So in His graciousness, He allows you to keep 90%. But that's the starting point that you have to realize, is that how much is He actually entitled to?
Everything.
100%.
Exactly.
And in His graciousness, He allows us 90%. 90%. Now, where in the Torah is the concept of the tithe instituted? Moshe goes up on Mount Sinai. He receives the Torah on Mount Sinai. He gets all these commandments. There's the Sabbath and thou shalt not kill. Where is the commandment that says to tithe?
Abraham.
Yes, exactly. Nowhere in the Torah that he received on Mount Sinai, in the book of Exodus, is there any mention of a tithe. The first time after that the tithe is mentioned is Leviticus 27. Let's go there. Leviticus 27. Verses 30 and 31. Now you must realize that from Exodus forward, we'll look at Genesis in a minute, but from Exodus forward and from the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai forward, this is the very first mention of the tithe. And it says in verse 30 and 31, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is Yahweh's. It is set apart unto Yahweh. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto a fifth part thereof. But nowhere in Exodus, in the Torah as it was given on Mount Sinai, was there the institution of a tithe, because they didn't need to be. They already had the tithe. So when we get to Leviticus, the very first mention of the tithe presupposes its existence. It presupposes that the tithe exists. And it acknowledges, it's simply a statement of acknowledgement that the tithe belongs to Yahweh. Does it say here that the tithe belongs to the Levites? No. It says that the tithe belongs to Yahweh. Now let's say my father owns a store. And he says, James, I'm going to let you manage the store. 90% of the profits you can keep, but I want 10%. And you run the store. I say, okay. He goes, tell you what I'm going to do. To give you some help, I've got a hired hand. I want you to pay him 10%. Okay, fine. I want you to give him my 10%. Or pay him for my 10% is a better way of putting it. All right, let's look at the next mention of the tithe. It's in Leviticus. It's in Numbers. Leviticus is almost over here. It never mentions it again. Numbers 18:21. Numbers 18:21. And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for inheritance for their service. Well, this is all the way over in the book of Numbers. This is later. This is a separate commandment. So we have one commandment that says that the tithe belongs to Yahweh. We have a totally different commandment that says to pay the Levites from it. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. These are not the same commandment. There's a commandment that acknowledges a tithe that already existed, that acknowledges that 10% belonged to Yahweh even before the Torah was given on Mount Sinai.
Yes.
And then there's another commandment separate from it that says that the Levites are to be paid from. Okay. I'm not going to go into Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 14 does not speak of the tithe as such. It speaks of what's called anybody know? The second tithe. The second tithe. How many of you know that Israel in the wilderness and Israel in the Old Testament times, if you will, how much did they tithe?
10%.
20%. 20%. There were two tithes. Okay? The first tithe went to the Levites. The second tithe was in Deuteronomy chapter 14. I guess we will go there because we need to be educated in Torah. So let's go to Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 through 29. Now, I want to emphasize, remember that when we were reading about the tithe before, it said that if you wanted to redeem your tithe, had to pay a penalty? Right? Couldn't just turn it into cash without paying a penalty. Verse 22, you shall truly tithe all the increase of your seed. By the way, people ask me, is the tithe on the net or on the gross?
Gross.
It's on the increase, the profit margin. Okay? It's on the profit margin. So, if I say I'm a salesman and I use my car in my work and I put gas in the car to travel around, I can deduct that from my tithe. That's my seed. You see what I'm saying? It's only the increase, only the profit margin. Okay? My investment, I don't have to tithe on my investment. It's just like when you're doing your taxes. Okay? By the way, the importance, let me tell you the significance of the tithe. How many of you heard the Worldwide Church of God under Armstrong?
Yep.
Those folks tithe. They tithe. And you know what? There were only 50 to 60,000 of them. 50 to 60,000 of them. One of the things they published is old Plain Truth magazine. How many remember the old Plain Truth magazine? The circulation of the Plain Truth magazine was more than the circulation at the time of Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report combined. And how much did it cost?
Nothing.
Nothing. Who paid for it?
They did.
They did, out of their tithes. I mean, remember all that free literature the Worldwide Church of God printed and distributed all over the world. How much did it cost? It just said free. Who paid for it? Tithes. They had a disproportionate effect on the world. They owned 2 colleges. They printed millions of pieces of free literature. Their impact on the world for their numbers was phenomenal. Well, if you run the numbers and you figure out, if you got 50,000 people and they're actually tithing, the amount of money is phenomenal. The amount of money is phenomenal. I have to say, I don't agree with everything Armstrong had to say. I always say about Armstrong that he was in a world in which people were blind. He had blurred vision. I mean, you got to admit, this guy was teaching Sabbath. He was teaching the feasts. He was teaching a form of two-house theology before there was a two-house movement. Okay? Like I said, I don't agree with everything Armstrong had to say. But boy, was he way ahead of his time. All right? Anyway, I just want to kind of emphasize how much could be done if this community was actually tithing. It would be uncanny, okay? And we don't have the tithing police, and we don't want to. You know, the Mormons, you know how they do their tithe? you meet with the bishop, which is the pastor of the local congregation. You meet with him once a year and, quote, settle your tithe. By settle your tithe, I mean you pull out and you present your check stubs like you were having an IRS audit. And you show that you tithed, and if you didn't tithe enough, you write a check for the difference. And if you don't, then you're not a member in good standing. Yeah. I'm not saying we need to go there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying there are groups that are not in the truth that are more serious about this than we are. And in this movement, people are serious about the Sabbath. They're serious about the feasts. Sometimes so serious about the tithe. I'm not the police. I'm not sitting here to criticize anybody, but I have to teach all of the Torah. Okay? So I'm going to teach the Torah. And the big question is, I think, is the tithe for today? Because it's amazing. It's amazing because in this movement, we've come out of the idea, is the law for today? And the answer, of course, that we have is yes, it's for all generations, forever. And then we realize that all Pastor Samuels of the Baptist Church and everything that teaches that the law is not for today, except for that tithe. Except when it comes time to pass that plate around, all of a sudden there's all this tithing nonsense. And so they realize that in Christianity, and in the idea that the law is not for today, the idea of the tithe is nonsense. I mean, if the law is not for today, I don't have to eat kosher, I don't have to tithe. But by the time you come to that realization, you also be coming to the realization that the Torah is for today. So even though you should have been tithing in Christianity, you should be now. But then there's those that come along and say, oh, but the tithe only goes to the Levites in the temple. Now I'm going to continue to show you why that's not true, but I've already shown you. Who does the tithe belong to? The Levites? Yahweh. The tithe belongs to Yahweh. Okay? He decides what to do with it. Now, let's say my boss owns the store that I work at. And he told me I could run it and keep 90%. And he hires Shmuel to work with me. Let's keep it simple. He hires Levy to work there. And he says for me to pay Levy out of his 10%. Okay. I'll pay Levy out of his 10%. Let's say Levy doesn't work there anymore. Let's say anything happens. But regardless of that, let's say for whatever reason Levy moves on. Does that mean I get to keep my boss's 10%?
No.
It never belonged to Levi. It always belonged to Yahweh. All right. So let's back to Deuteronomy chapter 14 here. Thou shalt surely tithe on the increase of your seed that the field brings forth year by year, and ye shall eat before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which ye shall choose in his name. There the tithe of your corn and of your wine and of your oil and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear Yahweh your Elohim always. And in the way be too long for you, so that you are not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from you, which Yahweh your Elohim shall choose to set his name there, when Yahweh your Elohim has blessed you, then shall you turn it into money. Wait a minute, I thought I had to pay 5%. Not the same time. You see, the liberal scholars say, oh, there's a contradiction in the Torah, but the rabbis say, no. No. We've always understood this as referring to the second tithe. Okay? And bind up the money in your hand that shall go into the place which Yahweh your Elohim shall choose. And you shall bestow that money for whatsoever your soul lusts after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatever your soul desires, and you shall eat there before Yahweh your Elohim, and you shall rejoice, and you and your household. In other words, the second tithe, you can use it to go to feasts. Arguably, maybe you could use it to go to conferences. Okay? But anyway, verse 27. And the Levite that is within your gates, you shall not forsake him, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. At the end of 3 years you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase. In other words, the leftover goes to the Levites. Verse 28, at the end of 3 years you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase the same year, and you shall lay it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no part nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow which are within your gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. In other words, the Hebrew calendar is on basically a 3-year cycle. That's why the original Torah reading cycle the Torah reading cycle is basically a 3-year cycle. How many years did it take to become an Essene? 3 years. Why? Because you had to go through the entire Torah from an Essene perspective. And that took 3 years of Torah readings. That was the original Torah cycle instead of the one that we have now that's all through in 1 year. Okay? So the Hebrew calendar works upon a 3-year cycle. And so for 2 years, the second tithe is kind of complicated. For 2 years, the second tithe is set aside into a fund, a personal fund, for pilgrimage. The third year, it's given to widows and orphans. Anything left over is given to the Levites. Okay? So people say, well, I tithe to the widows and orphans. No, that's the second tithe. Okay? That's a third of the second tithe. All right.
Is that the third one? Because the second one is the one.
Some people talk about a third tithe that they really don't understand the tithes. There are 2 tithes. Some people talk about a third tithe and they think that this is the third tithe. There are 2 tithes. Okay? The first tithe is just a flat out, off the top, 10%. Okay? Then the second tithe is a fund for pilgrimages. Anything left over after you make your pilgrimage goes to the Levites. And every third year, instead of you take that money and you use it to feed the widows and orphans.
And wouldn't that be a third one?
That's not a third one. That's every third. No, it's not a third 10%.
Well, it's separate outside of the first 2.
Right.
It's what I think that what you're referring to.
Right. It's a 3-year cycle. So you spend 2 years putting money into your fund for pilgrimages. After 2 years of putting money into your fund for pilgrimages, you should have enough money for your pilgrimage the third year. So now you take that third year tithe. In other words, 2 years should pay for 3 years of pilgrimages. Trust me, 10% of your income over 2 years will pay for all the conferences you ever want to go to. All the Sukkot feasts. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So, 10% of your income over a period of 2 years, for most people, not for everybody. Some people, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. It depends on what your income is, obviously.
So like on the third year,
But typically,
you kind of like, to put it in these terms, you kind of like disregard the setup for the first 2 years, and then you just divvy up your tithe for that year, and you spread it amongst the Levites, the orphans, and the widows, etc., etc.
right, because you've already got plenty of money in your pilgrimage fund. And then if you still have anything left over, you give it to the Levites.
I don't see anything that says the tithe is part of your income. If you look at...
Oh, the word increase, income.
Well, it's different. If we back up to verse 22, that's one thing I can tell you what I did.
I'm sorry? Well, this is the second tithe anyway. This isn't the tithe.
Well,
But go ahead.
It's based off the increase of the field.
Of the what?
The field.
Field.
Oh, okay. Because, and why?
Because it's a part of...
Who does the field belong to?
Yeah.
Okay, who does everything belong to? All right, so if I make my living with something instead of a field, it's not Yahweh's. Remember, 100% is his already. That's where you got to get the starting point. If you understand that 100% is his already, and then 90% is his gift to me. I don't give the tithe. You do not give the tithe. You see what I'm saying? He gives you the 90%.
Yeah.
Yes.
You see what I'm trying to say? So it's not, I'm not a farmer. Okay? Because the principle of the tithe, and we're going to get to this a little bit further on in the study when we get to Melchizedek. Abraham wasn't a farmer.
No, he wasn't.
Okay?
That wasn't a tithe, that was a prize because you were passing through his land.
Really? Well, I think I'll show you that it was the tithe.
Yes.
It had to be. I'll show you why as we continue this study. All right. So, remember now, Deuteronomy 14 is actually not the tithe; it's the second tithe, and I'm just doing that for educational purposes, so that everybody's fully educated about the whole ancient Israeli tithing system. I really wasn't planning to get too much into Deuteronomy 14 beyond that. My main thing is to contrast the other two passages which talk about the first tithe and point out that if we look at Numbers 27, Leviticus 27, 30 and 31, and Numbers 18, 21, we find that there are two separate Torah commandments about the first tithe. One acknowledges that it belongs to Yahweh, and the other one, separate from it, indicates that the Levites were to be paid from it. All right.
James, can you put that in perspective?
I'm sorry?
Could you put that in perspective?
Absolutely. I'm not. Can you clarify that? Because I thought I just did.
Well, he said that, and the Levites were paid from the first of the 10%.
They were paid out of the tithe fund. In other words, 10% belongs to Yahweh.
Right.
So then Yahweh, let's say, abstractly speaking, Yahweh has a bank account. We call that bank account, by the way, Hekdesh. That which belongs to Yahweh. Okay? It belongs to Yahweh, it doesn't belong to the Levites. And then the Levites are paid out of it. See what I'm trying to say? So,
Did he get all of it? Would that wipe out the account, let's say?
that's a good question. Does it say that?
What was the question?
Would it wipe out the account? In the storehouse,
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Can you repeat that, James?
He's asking, would they get paid all the time? Let me put this way. The question is, is that the only thing that a tithe can go to? And I'm going to show you no. First of all, the answer has to be no, because right now, today, there is no temple, and there is no Levitical priesthood operating in the temple. So, what do we do with our tithe?
Right.
It doesn't belong to us. It's not mine. It's Yahweh's tithe. So, what do I do with it? You see what I'm trying to say? That would be kind of like my dad. Like I said, the analogy of the business owner leaving me managing the business, telling me I can keep 90% for myself. He wants his 10%, and then pocketing his 10% too when Shmuel moves on. Okay? All right. I will show you from Scripture where that tithe goes, by the way, as we continue this study. Let's go. I want to talk now about Melchizedek. Let's turn to Genesis 14. How am I doing on time?
We just started.
35 minutes.
You got 2 hours.
I got 35 minutes. We're doing fine. All right, Genesis 14. Because I know obviously this topic is going to generate lots of questions, and I'm ready for that. And unfortunately, it's a topic that a lot of people are uncomfortable in this movement I'm teaching on, because, I'll be honest, a little disclaimer here. We in the leadership have a horse in the race. So, but yet we can't say, well, we're just not going to teach this area of Torah. Okay? I was very uncomfortable teaching this subject for a long time. Genesis 14, verse 18 through 20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High Elohim. He was having a Passover Seder, by the way, with Avram. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Avram, of the Most High Elohim, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High Elohim, which has delivered your enemies into your hand, and gave him tithes of all. In other words, everything. Not agricultural produce, everything.
Everything that he took.
Yes, his increase.
Exactly right.
But it wasn't an increase on farming.
Exactly.
It was just increase. Now, someone will say, to follow the rabbinical argument, someone will say, following the rabbinical format, or as Paul also follows that sort of format, what if a man should say? Okay, what if a man should say, this was not the tithe? This was not the tithe. This was just a tithe or a different tithe. All right? Well, let me show you two reasons that that is not the case. The first reason is, remember we said, where in the Torah was the commandment to tithe given? Leviticus 27 only acknowledges that there was a tithe. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, there's no place in Exodus on Mount Sinai where Yahweh says, thou shalt tithe. See what I'm saying? Because they already had the tithe. They didn't have to be told to start tithing. Then when they get to Leviticus 27, when they get to Leviticus 27:30, it just says in passing, the tithe belongs to Yahweh. It never stops and says to tithe, only says that the tithe belongs to Yahweh, because they already had the commandment to tithe. It's not recorded in Scripture exactly when that commandment was given, beyond the dawn of time, because how long has all of this been 100% Yahweh's? Ever. He created this place. It's all his. Okay? And throughout history, he's been letting us have 90%. Okay? Now, let me show you another reason why this has to be the same tithe as the tithe that is recorded in the Torah. Elsewhere in the Torah. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 7. Verses 4 through 5. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 4 through 5. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And truly, they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes, in other words, to be paid out of the tithe, of the people according to the Torah. That is, of their brothers, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him, and had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less blessed of the better. The less blessed of the is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he received them, of whom it is written that he lives. And as I may say, Levi also, who receives tithes, paid tithes to Abraham. For he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. The whole point of this little piece of Hebrews is to point out that Levi, who receives from the tithe, in the loins of Abraham, paid the tithe to Melchizedek. If it is not the same tithe, then Paul is making a false argument. This means nothing. What is the point of this entire reasoning that Paul lays out if the tithe Melchizedek paid to Abraham has no logical connection whatsoever to the tithe that the Levites were paid out of? Do you see what I'm saying? The whole point of Hebrews 7, verses 4 through 10, is that the tithe Abraham paid to Melchizedek is exactly the same tithe that the Levites received. Does that make sense? Okay? So, that means that we are fully correct in interpreting Genesis 14 verses 18 through 20 as speaking about the same tithe that the Levites received. Okay? That means this whole idea that the tithe is only on, don't only have to pay the tithe if I'm a farmer, doesn't fit.
Everything.
Because Abraham paid the tithe on
Everything.
everything. Okay. Now I want to turn to Malachi chapter 3.
No.
Malachi chapter 3. I know everybody that does their little, especially Christianity, that does their teaching on the tithe, they have to go to Malachi chapter 3 and just drive the point home. But I'm actually here to show you something in Malachi 3 that you may not have realized. So I want to start looking at Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and Yahweh and Adon, whom you seek, shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, whom you delight in. Behold, he shall come, says Yahweh of hosts. And who may abide the day of his coming, and who shall stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like a fuller's soap. When is this taking place? The end of days, the last days, the return of the Messiah, the judgment of man. Verse 3. And he shall sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto Yahweh an offering in righteousness. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto Yahweh as the days of old and in former years. And I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerer, and against the adulterer, and against the false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages. I want you to remember that phrase. Those that oppress the hireling in his wages, and the widow and the fatherless, and turn aside the stranger from his right. Fear not me, says Yahweh of hosts. For I am Yahweh, I change not. Therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. Even from the days of your fathers you are gone away from my ordinances, and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, says Yahweh of hosts. But you said, wherein shall we return? So what happens in verse 7 is that the Messiah returns. And he comes to the sons of Jacob, the Ephraimites. And he says, return unto me. Come back to my Torah. And there's this group of them that say, we did. What are you talking about? Isn't that what he's saying here in verse 7? What are you talking about? We already did. We are Torah observant. Verse 8. Will a man rob Elohim? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. In other words, the last day, when the Messiah returns, he finds a group of people that thought they were Torah observant. And he says, well, what about the tithe? What about the tithe? Now, this makes no sense. If tithing is not for today and tithing is not for the last days, why should Elohim come back and be upset that this group of people in the last days aren't tithing? It's the whole context here. Okay? But not only that, the amazing thing is he comes back in the last days. Thank you. He comes back in the last days and he finds a group of people who are Torah observant, and he says, turn back to my Torah. And they say, what are you talking about? We are Torah observant. He says, what about the tithe? Wasn't there a lot of people out there today in the Torah observant movement, except for that commandment, the 600, they keep the 612 commandments of the Torah.
Yeah.
I've been keeping the 612 commandments. All right. Then it says 10, bring you all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now wherewith, says Yahweh of hosts. You think it's talking about physical food here? No. Do you imagine the meat that this movement could be providing the world? Remember what I said about the old Worldwide Church of God, Armstrong, and what they were accomplishing? You imagine the meat this movement could be providing to the world with that kind of money? And then that's when he says, and then he says, verse 10 again, I go back to the beginning. Bring you all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith. And you've heard this a dozen times, but it's true. This is one of the few places where Elohim says, test me. Tithe and see what the results are. And see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Okay, now I want to turn to Matthew chapter 10.
James, I have a quick question.
Yes.
You mentioned before about the 3-year cycle. I know we've been talking about the 3-year cycle, but isn't it like a 7-year cycle, and on the 7th year you rest and then you
Yes, that is correct. The 7th year there is no produce. So the second tithe is not paid every 7th year.
Is it just the second, not the first also? Or?
Just the second. Now, of course, if you're a farmer, there's no produce that year either.
Yeah, so you have nothing to tithe from.
Exactly.
So how do you apply that?
But the first tithe is on everything. Go ahead.
How do you apply that into, because I know it's on a 7-year cycle, and how do you apply it to today if you want to follow it to the T? Meaning the first 2 years, it's on the first tithe, and then on the third year.
I know. Now we have to figure out which year is the 7th year.
Yeah.
And that's a new calendar, another calendar debate that we're not obviously going to settle. Yes, I'm aware of the issue though. Yes, I know what you mean. All right. Fortunately, the first tithe doesn't have such a problem. It's cut and dry.
On that, is it your understanding that only applies to the land of Israel and not us?
The second tithe?
All of that about the 7th year and the Jubilee and Sabbath year.
It's everybody.
The second tithe is a good principle, I would say, for you to exercise in your life if you financially can, because it would fund you being here.
Yes.
It would fund you being able to go to a Sukkot celebration. It also, helps take care of the widows and orphans. Okay? So I'm not here to try. I wasn't really here to try and push the second tithe. And I'm really not here to push anything. Torah is a choice you have to make. And maybe this is the thing that simply tells you, one of the things I want to say is that talking about spiritual warfare. Remember I said not so fast.
Yeah.
Okay? But the thing is, our forefathers during the Maccabean period, they turned not from the Torah when they were being roasted alive, when they were having their fingers cut off one by one. The things that they went through, okay? Peanuts compared to the sort of things that we concern ourselves with, okay? Those were the kinds of concerns they had. But are you prepared to pay the cost of the covenant? Okay? The financial obligations of the covenant, the cost of the covenant. For you, it may be a lot easier. It may not be your life.
Well, to help in our household, what we've been doing is we've been giving on our gross, not our net. And this is kind of like...
That's your offerings, yes. If you are not tithing, you can't give an offering. and tzedakah are above and beyond the tithe. And there's more than that. If you drop a penny, you drop a quarter, unless you're really poor, unless you're poor yourself. If you drop a quarter, leave it there. It's like it's the principle of the corners of the field and the principle of the produce that is dropped. Okay? Leave it for that poor person that needs it.
It's a merit. It's a merit.
These are the financial obligations of the covenant. If you understand the real financial obligations of the covenant, by the time you get the 10% and the second tithe and the corners of the field, you probably are, unless you're pretty well off, you may not have anything left for offerings. Okay? All right. And again, I'm not the tithing police. I'm not asking you to sit down with me and show me your W-2s, That's between you and Yahweh. I'm just teaching you the Torah. Okay? All right. Now I want to turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 8. How are we doing on time?
1 minute.
You're kidding me.
You can take longer.
Yeah, we started late, so I'll...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. All right. Chapter 10, verse 8. For nothing you have received, for nothing you shall give. Boy, this one's been quoted out of context so badly so many times. There's one in Proverbs that says, buy the truth and sell it not. How many of you heard that one? But if you look at the context, what it's actually saying in Proverbs is, treat the truth as a commodity that you are in the market for and you can't afford to sell it and to let go of any of it. That's what it's saying if you read the context of it. It's not saying that, you should be throwing conferences like this at your own expense without anybody chipping in. All right, that's not what it's saying.
What?
About the truth.
Buy the truth and sell it not. I don't remember the exact verse in Proverbs, but where it's at, but it's in Proverbs. But if you look at the context, what it is saying is to treat the truth as a commodity that you are in the market to acquire, not in the market to let go of any of. It's a precious commodity. The truth is something that you want as much of as possible, and you're not willing to let go of any of your truth. That's what it's saying. It's not saying anything but that. This passage, for nothing you have received and for nothing you will give, been quoted so out of context. Because if you read the next few verses, starting in verse 9, provide neither gold nor silver nor lesser coin in your belts, pack not for the journey, either 2 coats or sandals or a staff, for the laborer is worthy of his food. And into whatever city or town you will enter, inquire who is honorable, and there abide until you will go out from there. In other words, in the very next breath, Yeshua sent his Talmudim out into the community to teach and to be supported financially by the community. Isn't that exactly what in fact, this parallels something Josephus says about the Essenes. Josephus, Wars of the Jews 2:8-4. And if any of their sect come from other places, that they have what they have lies open for them, just as if it were their own. And they go into such as they never knew before, as if they had ever been so long acquainted with them, for which reason they carry nothing with them when they travel into remote parts, though still they take their weapons with them for fear of thieves. Accordingly, there is in every city where they live one appointed particularly to take care of strangers and provide garments and other necessities for them. In other words, the Essenes, a lot of people don't realize this, when you became an Essene back then, what you did was you gave everything you owned to the community. They were serious about this 100% thing.
Yes.
You gave everything you owned to the community. This is the same way the early Nazarenes were at the very beginning, because they came out of Essenism. That's why it says in the book of Acts, they shared all things in common. They gave 100%, okay? And they were issued one garment, a pair of sandals, and a shovel. If you wore out your sandals, you went to the overseer and said, "I need a new pair of sandals." The overseer might say, "Well, let me see you." Okay, yeah, I guess you do need a new pair of sandals. But he would oversee the spending of that 90% that was for you. Now, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that was the community they were living in.
Right.
So when Yeshua sent his Talmudim out into the community to teach, when he says, "For nothing you have received, for nothing you have received, for nothing you will give," he was not saying that they shouldn't be supported by the community. In fact, it's exactly what he was sending them to do, to go be supported by the community. Yes.
In Matthew 10, they couldn't take a belt, not 2 pair of sandals.
Right.
Did they take their little shovel?
No, but they took a sword.
A sword, and they did the same thing.
Yes. Now, the reason it says is, going back to Matthew 10:10, the laborer is worthy of his hire, or the laborer is worthy of his food. You see that? Yeshua sends them, and he says, specifically what he's saying is that they were entitled to be supported. The laborer is worthy of his food. Okay? Now, I want us to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 through 18. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 through 18. This is the only place where the New Testament quotes the New Testament. By the time 1 Timothy had been written, apparently the book of Matthew had been written and was in circulation. Verse 17 and 18 says, "Those elders who conduct themselves well should be esteemed worthy of double honor, especially those who," remember this phrase, "labor in the word and teaching. For Scripture says, you should not muzzle the ox while threshing." That's Deuteronomy 25:4. "And the laborer is worthy of his wage." Well, that's actually quoting Matthew 10:10. That's quoting Yeshua. Okay? And I want you to realize that it's connecting this with "you should not muzzle the ox while threshing." In other words, it's making an allegory about the ox that tramples the corn is allowed to eat from the corn. And now I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 through 14. By the way, why do you think Abraham tithed to Melchizedek? Does anybody know while you're looking for 1 Corinthians chapter 9? The book of Jasher basically gives us the clue.
I thought it was because the simple fact that he was confirmation that he wasn't going nuts, listen to these voices, but yet he saw the high priest of the Most High coming.
How many of you have heard of the book of Jasher? Everybody heard the book of Jasher?
Yeah.
Okay. In the book of Jasher, we find out who Melchizedek was. Melchizedek is a title. Go, you had a question?
No, I was just going to comment on what you said earlier about, I know you're trying to say Shem.
Shem. Melchizedek was Shem. Okay? Who was Shem to Abraham? Well, according to the book of Jasher, if you do the Bible math and the Torah, this works. During Abraham's youth, he was sent away by his father to protect him from Nimrod. King Nimrod was trying to kill him. And he was sent away, and he was raised by Noah and Shem, who brought him up in the covenant and taught him Torah. Shem was Abraham's Torah teacher. Abraham was surrendering Yahweh's tithe to support his Torah teacher. Okay? All right. Now, this is expressed in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 through 14. It doesn't mention Melchizedek or Abraham or that specifically, but also, I only and Barnabas, we have not the power not to work. Now, he doesn't mean not to work in the ordinary sense of the term, what we might understand it to mean. Because trust me, everybody that's in this ministry that's doing this work they're working their tookus off. Okay?
Amen.
Amen. Anybody that knows me knows and knows the work that I'm doing. I'm working. But he says, who is this who labors in the service or in the ministry by the expense of his nephesh, or in other words, at his own expense? Or who is he who plants a vineyard and from its fruits does not eat? Or who is he who tends the flock and from the milk of his flock does not eat? Do I say these things as a son of man? Behold, the Torah also said these things. For it is written in the Torah of Moshe, you shall not muzzle the ox that threshes. Deuteronomy 25:4, the same thing that we read in 1 Timothy, where it also talked about, quoted the passage about the laborer is worthy of his hire, which was quoting Matthew 10, which we saw the context of. I, as a chosen to Eloah about an ox. In other words, he's more concerned about an ox than he is with his teachers. But it is known that because of us, he said it, and because of us it is written, because it is a need that the plowman plow unto hope, and that he who threshes the hope of the harvest, if he has sown spiritual things among you, is it a great thing if we reap things of the flesh among you. In other words, he says, if we teach you spiritual truth, it is nothing if you feed us and clothe us and house us. Those who labor in the Beit Kadesh, the Beit Kadesh is the temple. Who labors in the temple? The Levites. Those who labor in the temple are sustained from the temple. Well, they're sustained from the temple, it says. Notice. In other words, they're paid out of the tithe, right? And those who labor for the altar have a portion with the altar. Well, he's talking about the Kohanim. They're paid from the tithe, right? Then get this, he says, so also our Adon commanded that those who are proclaiming his good news should live by his good news. Or his gospel. What is the gospel?
Truth.
Well, we're listening to the Torah. Okay? In other words, those who are laboring in the Word, just like the Levites, should be paid out of the tithe. That's what he's saying. A lot of people say, the New Testament doesn't teach anything about teachers in the New Testament being paid out of the tithe. It's right here. It is right here. Mark it. It's right there. Those who labor in the temple are paid and in the from the temple, and in the same way also those who labor in the Word are entitled to the same treatment.
Does that count for missionaries as well?
I'm sorry?
Does that count for missionaries as well?
Sure. Sure. Those who labor in the Word. Okay? So, remember, a lot of people think that there's nothing about the tithe in the New Testament. Let's turn to Matthew 23 real quick and we'll look at one more thing before we close. Well, actually, we'll look at two more things. Let's look at Matthew 23 first real quick. I did want to take this full circle and go back to the Tanakh real quick before we close. But Matthew 23. Verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. What's a hypocrite? Somebody who teaches something but then doesn't actually do it, right? For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin. In other words, even on your garden herbs. And have omitted the weightier matters of the Torah, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and here's where Yeshua teaches the tithe, and not to leave the other undone. See what it says? This is Yeshua. Yeshua here says not to leave the tithing undone.
What verse is that?
That is Matthew 23:23.
Okay, great.
Now, why would he do that if the temple was about to be destroyed in just 30 years and nobody was ever going to have to tithe again? Why waste a breath on it? And you may say, well, I don't know, I don't want to tithe because I don't know how they're going to spend it. I don't have this in mind, the passage exactly in mind. It's in Mark and Luke both. Remember the story of the widow's mite? You look at the story, Yeshua is just criticizing very vehemently the Sadducees, who were the ones that were running the temple in those days. And he talks about how they robbed the widows and orphans. Remember all that? And then he takes this widow who just put 2 mites in, okay, which is like 2 pennies, just a tiny amount of money. And she had just put it in the fund. There were these things that you could throw the money into. It's kind of ornate. They would kind of go down. Yeah. And and Yeshua turns around and he says, "Look, she just wasted her money giving it to these good-for-nothings." No, he said she's given more than anybody else. Yahweh credited her with the gift. It was their responsibility that they were misappropriating it. But Yahweh is going to recognize what she did. See what I'm saying? All right. Now I want to close by going back to Malachi, chapter 3. Verse 7. Even from the days of your fathers you are gone away from my ordinances and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, says Yahweh of hosts. But you said, wherein shall we return? Will a man rob Elohim? Yes, you have robbed me, but you say, wherein have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. And I want you to now go back up to verse 5. Remember that phrase. One of the things he criticizes here in the judgment is against those that oppress the hireling in his wages. That is what Yeshua was referring to when he said the laborer is worthy of his wage. In 1 Timothy, when Paul refers back to what Yeshua was saying, they're both referring back here to Malachi. They are referring to the tithe. You see what I'm saying? All right. So I hope I've cleared up some of the crazy ideas that circulate about this issue. Yes?
I'm sorry, I missed the verse and chapter when you were speaking about those teachers and laborers among you, like the missionaries, when she asked the question, and you said, yes, they should be covered.
They can be paid for the tithe. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, what scripture reference was that you were referring to? Do you remember?
Well, about, yes, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 13 specifically. In fact, I have verses 6 through 14 to bring the whole context together with 1 Timothy 5, 17 through 18. And it's the scriptural basis basically for saying that, remember now, the tithe already belonged to Yahweh. It's the scriptural basis for saying that those who labor in His Word are, alongside, equal to the Levites, entitled to be paid out of Yahweh's tithe.
Did you have another one from the Torah that balanced that?
Were you here at the beginning? Were you here?
I'm sorry.
No, if you weren't here at the beginning, I real quickly and briefly, the first time the tithe is mentioned in the Mosaic Torah is Leviticus 27:30 through 31. It just simply recognizes that there was a tithe. It doesn't institute a tithe. We demonstrated by comparing Genesis 14:18 through 20 to Hebrews 7:4 through 5 that the Melchizedek tithe was the same as the Levitical tithe and already existed. And then we noticed that Leviticus 27:30 through 31 on the one hand recognized Yahweh's right to the tithe, that the tithe is Yahweh's, but doesn't direct it to the Levites. That's Numbers 18:21, which is a totally separate commandment, which says that the Levites are to be paid out of it. So that there is a distinction between the commandment to tithe and the commandment to pay the Levites out of the tithe. A lot of people think the tithe is paid directly to the Levites. Not so. Tithe is paid to Yahweh, and then the Levites are paid out of it. All right. I'll go ahead and close now. Anybody has any more questions? I feel I'm open to answering any questions that I can. But I think my time may be up. Yes.
I always like what I've heard taught to me that if it doesn't belong to us, and I don't give that 10%, but I'm actually stealing something. See, I know it's harsher for some people's thinking, but if I don't, it's not even 10% doesn't belong to you. If you don't pay, you're stealing from Yahweh. Not just it belongs to him, you're stealing. How can you expect to receive a blessing in your life if you're stealing from Yahweh? In fact, that's one of the more areas people say I'm having trouble. Let's check where your priorities are. I hate to be so cold and direct for some people's thinking, but if it belongs to Yahweh, then we are stealing it.
When you were robbing the tithes and offerings, what are the expected offerings other than the free will and burnt offerings and peace offerings?
Yeah, well, they're lengthy and they're laid out, but of course we cannot give the offerings from him.
Okay.
Because there is no temple.
Okay.
Now, we can give financial offerings because, but we cannot give the animal offerings. So other than that, offering is just anything above and beyond the tithe. So
there isn't a defined expectation there that
no, that's just charitable giving.
Good.
And Yahweh loves a charitable giver. But it has to be something that you are giving. All right.